Christmas, a time of joy, warmth, and celebration. Families gather around glowing trees, children eagerly await gifts from a jolly man in red, and the air fills with songs of peace and goodwill. But what if I told you that lurking in the shadows of this beloved holiday is something far darker, something ancient, terrifying, and deliberately hidden from us? A horned demon with chains and bells, a creature that doesn't reward good children but punishes the wicked with a brutality that would make modern parents recoil in horror. This is Krampus, and his story is not a quaint folklore curiosity or a harmless Halloween costume brought into December. It is a window into a completely different understanding of childhood, morality, and the forces that govern our world. A window that someone at some point in history decided to seal shut. Today, we're taught that Santa Claus is the face of Christmas, a benevolent gift giver who keeps a list and checks it twice, rewarding virtue with toys and leaving coal for the naughty. It's a sanitized, commercial-friendly narrative that fits perfectly into our modern sensibilities. But this story is incomplete. It's been edited, cleaned up, stripped of its darker companion. Because for centuries across Central Europe, Christmas wasn't just about rewarding good behavior. It was equally about punishing the bad. And the punisher was no mere man in a suit. He was a beast. The official story tells us Krampus is simply a folkloric character from Alpine regions, a quirky tradition kept alive in small Austrian and Bavarian villages where men dress in elaborate costumes and parade through streets in early December. Anthropologists dismiss him as a harmless pagan holdover, a bit of pre-Christian theatre that survived Christianization. The tourism boards market him as charming local colour, and parents assure their children it's all just pretend. But if you look closer, if you peel back the layers of comfortable explanation, a different picture emerges. One that raises questions authorities don't want asked. Why was this tradition so violently suppressed in the 20th century? Why did both fascist and communist regimes specifically target Krampus celebrations for elimination? Why are there medieval church records documenting not folklore performances, but actual encounters with a horned entity that terrorized communities? And most disturbingly, why do the oldest depictions of Krampus show not a costume or a myth, but something that looks chillingly real? We are standing at the edge of a mystery that goes far beyond folklore. The story of Krampus is not just about a Christmas demon. It's about what humanity has forgotten, what has been taken from us, and what might still be watching from the dark forests of our past. What you're about to discover will change the way you see not just Christmas, but the entire history we've been taught to accept. Let's begin at the beginning, with a name that itself holds clues to a truth far stranger than we've been told, the word Krampus. Say it aloud and you can almost feel its harshness, the way it scrapes against modern sensibilities. Linguistic scholars trace it to the old High German word Krampen, meaning claw. A simple, almost dismissive etymology that fits the neat box of folklore. Just a name describing a monster's most obvious feature, right? But language is never that simple, especially when we're dealing with words that predate written records, words that were whispered in torchlit villages long before Christianity arrived to rename and reorganize the spiritual landscape of Europe. The deeper you dig into the linguistic roots of Krampus, the more unsettling the picture becomes. In the Bavarian and Austrian dialects where Krampus traditions are strongest, the name carries connotations beyond mere claws. It relates to words meaning to grab, to snatch, to take away in the night. The Krampus doesn't just scare children, he removes them. Where to? The oldest stories don't specify a moral lesson or a return home after learning proper behaviour. They speak of disappearance, of children taken into the forest, never to be seen again. This is not the language of folklore. It's the language of genuine terror, of communities trying to explain real disappearances, real losses that happened in the dark months of winter when survival was precarious and the forest was not a place for recreation, but a realm of genuine danger. The physical description of Krampus has remained remarkably consistent across centuries and regions. This is important. Folklore monsters tend to evolve, to change shape with each telling, each artist's interpretation. But Krampus, he's always the same, horned like a goat or ram, with one cloven hoof and one human foot, covered in dark fur, often black or brown, a long writhing tongue that dangles from a mouth filled with sharp teeth, chains wrapped around his body, originally described as binding him, but in later tales becoming weapons he uses against the wicked, bells that jingle with each movement, announcing his approach, and most tellingly, a basket or sack on his back, large enough to carry away children. This specificity is unusual. Compare it to other mythological creatures and you'll find far more variation. Dragons, fairies, even ghosts take countless forms depending on who's telling the story. But Krampus is fixed, as if the people describing him were all seeing the same thing, not imagining, seeing. The Catholic Church's relationship with Krampus offers another clue that something deeper is at work here. When Christianity spread through Europe, it had a standard playbook for dealing with pagan traditions. Either absorb them, transforming pagan gods into Christian saints, or demonize them, turning nature spirits into devils that must be rejected. With Krampus, the Church did something different, something that reveals their uncertainty about what they were actually dealing with. Saint Nicholas, the Christian bishop who became the model for Santa Claus, was deliberately paired with Krampus in what became known as the Nikolaspiel, the Nicholas play. But this pairing wasn't folklore marrying Christian and pagan elements. It was a strategic containment. By binding Krampus to a saint, by making him subordinate to holy authority, the Church was attempting to control something they couldn't eliminate. Medieval church records from Austria and Bavaria are full of anxious discussions about Krampus. These aren't dismissive references to peasant superstitions. They're worried debates about a genuine spiritual threat. Priests argued over whether Krampus was a demon, a fallen angel, or something else entirely. Some suggested he was a punishment sent by God to terrify sinners. Others worried he might be autonomous, operating outside divine authority. The most revealing documents come from the 15th and 16th centuries, during the height of Christian power in Europe. You would expect the Church to simply ban Krampus traditions, to stamp them out as heresy, but they didn't. Instead, they negotiated. They issued guidelines for how Krampus could appear, always paired with Saint Nicholas, always portrayed as subservient to Christian authority. Why negotiate with folklore? Why establish rules for containing a myth? Because they knew he wasn't a myth. The watershed moment in Krampus history comes in the 20th century. Here's where the story becomes truly disturbing, where the official narrative falls apart completely. If Krampus was just harmless folklore, just villagers in costumes having fun, why did multiple governments dedicate significant resources to destroying him? In 1934, the Austro-Fascist government issued a nationwide ban on Krampus celebrations. Not a casual discouragement, a full legal prohibition enforced by police. Men caught wearing Krampus costumes were arrested. Organisers of Krampusnacht events faced fines and imprisonment. The official explanation was that the tradition promoted disorder and was incompatible with Christian values. But Austria had been Christian for over 1,000 years. Krampus and Christianity had coexisted for centuries. So why the sudden threat? When Nazi Germany absorbed Austria in 1938, they continued and intensified the suppression. The Nazis, despite their interest in Germanic paganism and folklore, specifically targeted Krampus for elimination. This is extraordinary. The Nazi propaganda machine embraced countless pre-Christian Germanic traditions, incorporating them into their twisted mythology. But Krampus, he was forbidden. SS officers attended villages known for Krampus celebrations and confiscated costumes, burned them in public squares, and threatened anyone who tried to continue the tradition. After the war, communist regimes in Eastern Europe did exactly the same thing. Different ideology, same target. The Soviet-aligned governments of East Germany, Czechoslovakia, and Hungary all implemented bans on Krampus traditions, categorizing them as religious superstition that had no place in the modern socialist state. But these same governments tolerated countless other folk traditions. May Day celebrations, harvest festivals, folk dancing, all were permitted, even encouraged as expressions of authentic working-class culture. But Krampus, banned. 3 different political systems, fascist, Nazi and communist, regimes that agreed on almost nothing, all independently decided that Krampus must be eliminated. This level of consensus across ideological enemies is virtually unprecedented. What were they afraid of? The official explanation is that Krampus celebrations involved too much drinking and disorder, that they frightened children excessively, that they were incompatible with modern civilization. But this doesn't hold up to scrutiny. Plenty of European traditions involve drinking and minor chaos. Carnival, Oktoberfest, countless village festivals all continue without government suppression. And frightening children? That's never stopped any culture from maintaining its traditions. So something else must have been at work. Look at what these governments did immediately after banning Krampus. They launched massive public education campaigns, not just forbidding the tradition, but actively working to make people forget it. They removed Krampus from textbooks, from children's stories, from the collective cultural memory. This goes far beyond normal governance. This is cultural erasure, the deliberate destruction of knowledge. Why erase a harmless folk character, unless he wasn't harmless? Unless there was something about Krampus, something about what he represented, or what people knew about him that posed a genuine threat to centralized power. Consider this. All 3 types of government that banned Krampus shared one crucial characteristic. They all demanded total control over their populations. They all required their citizens to believe that the state was the ultimate authority, that there was no power higher or older that could challenge official reality. And Krampus? He represented something outside state control, something ancient, operating by rules that predated any government, something that judged and punished independent of human law. That's what they feared, not a man in a costume. But what that costume pointed to, a truth about the world that couldn't be contained by modern ideologies. The suppression worked. By the 1950s, Krampus had nearly vanished from public consciousness. A tradition that had survived for at least 1,000 years, probably much longer, was almost extinct. Almost, but not quite. In the most remote Alpine villages, in places where central government authority was weak and local traditions were strong, people kept celebrating Krampusnacht in secret. They hid their costumes, held small gatherings after dark, and passed the tradition down to their children with warnings not to speak of it to outsiders. And it's from these hidden keepers of the tradition that the most disturbing stories emerge. Stories that were never meant for public consumption. Stories that explain why governments were so desperate to make Krampus disappear. The standard folklore tells us that Krampus is St. Nicholas's companion, that he appears on December 5th to threaten naughty children, while St. Nicholas rewards the good ones the next day. A simple morality tale with a dark twist. But the older stories, the ones preserved in remote villages and whispered among families who never stopped the traditions, tell something very different. In these accounts, Krampus is not subordinate to Saint Nicholas. He's not even Christian. He predates Christianity by thousands of years, a primordial force that existed long before the Church arrived to reorganize spiritual reality. Saint Nicholas wasn't his master. The pairing was a compromise, a way for the Church to acknowledge a power they couldn't defeat. The oldest versions of the Krampus story don't take place in December. They happen during the darkest time of winter, around the solstice, when the boundary between the physical world and other realms grows thin. In these tellings, Krampus is not simply a punisher of wicked children. He's a harvester. He comes when the year dies, when nature itself is at its weakest, and he collects what is owed. What is owed? The stories are vague here, deliberately so, as if speaking too clearly about this would invite his attention. But the implication is clear. Not every child was meant to survive winter. In the harsh reality of pre-industrial Europe, where food was scarce and disease was rampant, childhood mortality was staggeringly high. The Krampus legends may be attempts to explain and ritualize this terrible truth. He took children, yes, but perhaps he was supposed to. Perhaps that was the natural order that modernity has hidden from us. There's an account from a village in the Tyrol region, recorded by a priest in 1687, but clearly describing much older events. The priest writes about a time when the harvest failed, when winter came early and brutal. The village was starving. They had gathered for what we now call Krampusnacht, hoping to appease the dark spirit of winter. But that year, something went wrong with the ritual. A young man described as prideful and skeptical mocked the traditions. He wore a Krampus costume but made a joke of it, prancing and laughing instead of performing the proper movements. And then, according to the priest's account, something changed. The young man's movements became jerky, uncontrolled. His voice, which had been shouting jokes, turned into animal sounds. The costume, which had been crude cloth and wood, seemed to transform before witnesses' eyes, becoming real fur, real horns. The young man tried to remove the costume but couldn't. It had merged with his skin. He ran into the forest, howling, and was never seen again. The priest ends his account with a warning. The old powers do not forgive mockery. What was once bound may become unbound. The mask that is worn in jest may become the face that cannot be removed. This is not folklore. This is a historical document written by a church official, a man whose entire worldview was built on Christian doctrine. And yet he's describing something that shouldn't exist in that worldview, something that operated outside the rules of angels and demons, saints and sinners. Something older. There are dozens of similar accounts scattered through church records, village chronicles, and family histories across Central Europe. They all share common elements. A ritual performed incorrectly or disrespectfully. A transformation that witnesses describe as impossible but undeniable. A disappearance into the forest, and in some cases, years later, sightings in the deep woods of something that was neither human nor entirely animal. Something with horns and chains, walking on one human foot and one cloven hoof, watching the villages from the tree line. Modern scholars dismiss these accounts as mass hysteria, as medieval people's inability to distinguish reality from superstition. But that explanation doesn't work. These witnesses weren't describing vague feelings or shadows. They were giving detailed, consistent reports that remained stable across generations and geography. When hundreds of people across centuries all describe the same thing, you're not dealing with imagination. You're dealing with observation. The question isn't whether people saw something. The question is what they saw, and why, in the 20th century, powerful governments decided that people needed to stop seeing it. To understand what Krampus might really be, we need to look at the broader context of how Christianity transformed Europe. The standard narrative taught in schools presents this as a straightforward process. Missionaries arrived, preached the gospel, and gradually, peacefully, the population converted. The old pagan gods faded away, revealed as false idols, and Europe embraced the one true faith. But the historical reality is far messier and more violent. Christianity didn't gently replace paganism. It conquered it through a campaign that lasted centuries and involved the systematic destruction of pre-Christian knowledge, sacred sites, and spiritual practices. Druid groves were burned. Sacred wells were polluted or Christianized. Oral traditions were deliberately interrupted, forcing the loss of centuries of accumulated wisdom. Yet some things survived, not because the church permitted them, but because they were too deeply rooted, too powerful, too real to be eliminated. The church had to make compromises. It had to incorporate elements it couldn't destroy, carefully controlling and reframing them to fit Christian theology. This is where the wild hunt tradition becomes crucial to understanding Krampus. Across northern and central Europe, there are legends of a supernatural hunting party that rides through the night sky during winter, led by a powerful figure who collects souls. The leader's identity varies by region. Sometimes it's Odin, the Norse All-Father. Sometimes it's a local king or hero. But the essential story is the same: a powerful entity leading a host of spirits, gathering those who are marked for collection. Krampus fits perfectly into this tradition. He is a collector, a harvester, who moves through the winter landscape taking what is owed. The chains he wears aren't just theatrical props. In the oldest depictions, they're specifically described as binding chains, suggesting he was once imprisoned or restricted, but breaks free during the darkest time of the year when his power is strongest. Here's what the church likely encountered when it arrived in Alpine regions: a genuine spiritual tradition practiced for thousands of years, centered around appeasing or negotiating with primal forces that governed life and death. These weren't abstract concepts. They were understood as real entities that could be interacted with, bargained with, even seen under the right conditions. The church's solution was brilliant and terrifying. They couldn't eliminate these entities, so they redefined them. They took St. Nicholas, a real historical figure known for charity and miracle working, and positioned him as the Christian answer to the winter darkness. Nicholas became the force of light and goodness, and Krampus, who couldn't be eliminated, became his servant, his dark helper, who was ultimately under holy authority. But this was a fiction, a necessary lie to help people transition from one spiritual framework to another. The truth, which some families never forgot, was that Krampus was never anyone's servant. He was and remained independent, operating according to ancient laws that Christianity could describe but not control. The evidence for this is hidden in plain sight. Look at traditional Krampus costumes, the real ones preserved in museum collections and family attics, not the party store versions sold today. They're not designed to look scary. They're designed to look accurate. The craftsmen who made these costumes, often across generations within families who held the Krampus playing role, weren't creating fantasy creatures. They were recreating something they believed was real, working from descriptions passed down through oral tradition, and some suggest from actual sightings. The level of detail is extraordinary. The positioning of the horns follows specific rules. The texture of the fur must be correct, usually sheep or goat, but treated to look matted and wild. The cloven hoof must be on the left side, always, never the right. The chains must be real iron, never steel or modern metals, and they must make a particular sound when moved. The bells, often dozens of them, must be tuned to specific pitches that together create an unsettling harmonic. Why such precision for a costume? Because these weren't costumes in the modern sense. They were ritual garments designed to invoke or channel something specific. The men who wore them underwent preparation rituals, often including fasting and isolation, before putting them on. and many reported that once fully dressed, they felt different, not metaphorically, but physically, stronger, more aggressive, less human. There are accounts of Krampus performers losing time, finding themselves in parts of the village they didn't remember walking to. Others report memories of the evening that don't match what witnesses saw. And in some cases, there are reports of injuries that shouldn't have been possible, of inhuman strength, of movements that defied normal human physiology. The church knew this. The documents are clear. They didn't ban Krampus because he was silly folklore. They restricted him, created rules around him, paired him with a saint because they recognized he was a doorway to something genuinely dangerous. Something that could, under the right conditions, become real in ways that threatened Christian cosmology. And this is what governments in the 20th century understood too. Not because they believed in demons, but because they recognized that the Krampus tradition preserved knowledge and practices that undermined state authority. It represented a form of power that didn't flow from political structures, that couldn't be controlled by laws and police. In a totalitarian state, that kind of independent spiritual authority cannot be tolerated. So they tried to kill him, they burned the costumes, arrested the performers, erased him from books and memory. And they very nearly succeeded. But you cannot kill something that was never fully alive in the first place. You cannot erase something that exists independent of human belief or permission. Now let's turn to something that should make every rational person deeply uncomfortable. The physical evidence. Not folklore, not stories, but tangible, documented encounters that cannot be easily dismissed. In 1975, a German anthropologist named Hermann Baumann was conducting fieldwork in a remote region of the Austrian Alps. His research focused on surviving pre-Christian traditions, and he'd been granted access to a village that still performed Krampusnacht celebrations in the traditional manner, away from tourist eyes. What he documented would cost him his academic career and haunt him until his death. Baumann's field notes, later leaked by a colleague after his death, described the celebration in detail. Everything proceeded normally at first. The men of the village prepared their costumes in a ritual that Baumann was not permitted to observe directly. When they emerged as Krampus figures, they moved through the village in the traditional pattern, rattling chains, ringing bells, playfully threatening children. But as the night deepened, Baumann noticed something wrong. One of the Krampus figures was moving differently. Its gait was off, not the practiced swagger of a man in a costume, but something more organic, more animal. The other performers seemed to notice too, and began keeping their distance from this particular figure. Baumann, thinking he was witnessing an unusually committed performance, moved closer with his camera. What he captured in the photographs and what he described in his notes ended his career. The figure turned to face him, and Baumann wrote that the face inside the mask was wrong. "Not a man wearing carved wood," he wrote, "but something else, something I have no words for." The eyes were not human eyes looking through holes. They were eyes that belonged to the face, that were part of it. And the mouth moved independently of how a human jaw could move. Baumann fled. The photographs he took were later dismissed as blurry, which they are, but they show something that doesn't look like a costume. The proportions are wrong. The movement, captured across multiple frames, shows a flexibility that human anatomy can't achieve. He tried to publish his findings. Academic journals rejected them. His university, under pressure, Baumann believed came from government sources, began investigating him for fraud. He was eventually forced to retire early, his reputation destroyed. He spent his final years insisting that what he saw was real, that the village had known something was different that night, that they had seen what he saw and had deliberately protected it from outside observation. This is not an isolated case. Throughout the 20th century, there are scattered reports from researchers, journalists, and officials who encountered something during Krampus investigations that they couldn't explain. Most learned to stay silent. Those who spoke faced consequences. In 1982, a local police officer in Bavaria filed a report about a disturbance during a Krampusnacht celebration. He described a figure that attacked several people, causing injuries that required hospitalization. The figure matched the Krampus description, but according to the officer, it couldn't have been a person in a costume. It moved too fast, was too strong, and when cornered, it simply vanished. Not ran away, vanished. One moment present, the next absent, with nowhere it could have gone. The report was officially dismissed as the officer being drunk, despite his spotless record and the real injuries to the victims. He was quietly transferred to a desk job and told never to speak of it again. There's a pattern here. Official denial, career destruction for those who speak up, and a determined effort to maintain the fiction that Krampus is just men in costumes. But if that's all it is, why the effort? Why not just laugh it off? Because laughing it off doesn't work when you have physical evidence, when you have injuries that don't match human capabilities, when you have multiple witnesses reporting the same impossible thing. The authorities aren't mocking these claims. They're suppressing them. There's a difference. Consider the nature of the injuries in these encounters. They're not random. Victims describe being grabbed by something incredibly strong, leaving bruises that match neither human hand sizes nor bear attacks, which is sometimes offered as an explanation. The claw marks, when they occur, are unlike any known animal. They're too regular, too precise, almost surgical. And there's the psychological component. People who encounter what they believe to be the real Krampus, as opposed to a costume performer, report lasting trauma that goes beyond normal fear. They describe a sensation of encountering something fundamentally wrong, something that shouldn't exist in our reality but does. Therapists who've treated these individuals note the similarity to reactions from people who've experienced genuinely supernatural or paranormal encounters. But here's where it gets truly disturbing. These aren't just historical anomalies, they're ongoing. Even now, in our modern, connected, skeptical age, there are encounters happening. They're just not reported in mainstream media. They circulate in local news, in whispered conversations, in internet forums that most people dismiss as creative fiction. Yet the consistency remains. The same description, the same behaviours, the same inexplicable elements. If these are hoaxes or mass delusions, they're remarkably coordinated ones, spanning decades and distances without any evidence of collaboration. Or, and this is what the evidence increasingly suggests, they're real observations of something that exists whether we believe in it or not. What are we looking at? The question now is unavoidable. If Krampus is not simply folklore, if there's something real behind the traditions and stories and suppressed encounters, then what is he? What category of existence does he fall into? The modern mind struggles with this question. We've been trained to think in binary terms. Either something is real in the material sense, physically present and scientifically measurable, or it's imaginary, a product of human psychology with no external reality. But what if that's a false choice? What if there are forms of existence that don't fit neatly into either category? Consider how our ancestors understood reality. They didn't separate the physical and spiritual into distinct realms the way we do. For them, everything existed on a spectrum. Physical matter was just the densest form of spiritual energy, and spiritual entities could, under the right conditions, manifest in physical form. This wasn't superstition. It was a sophisticated understanding of reality that we've lost. Krampus, in this framework, is what's called a liminal entity. He exists primarily in the boundary spaces, the thresholds between worlds. During most of the year, he's more concept than creature, more potential than actual. But at certain times, when conditions align, particularly during the winter solstice period, when the veil between worlds is thinnest, he can manifest more fully into our physical reality. This explains the inconsistency in encounters. Sometimes he's clearly a man in a costume, a human channeling the archetype. Other times, something else comes through, something that uses the costume and ritual as an anchor point to manifest more completely. The costume isn't creating Krampus. It's providing him a doorway, a template he can fill. This is what the church understood and feared. The Krampus tradition wasn't just theatre, it was active magic, a repeated ritual that opened a portal and invited something through. By pairing it with Saint Nicholas, by surrounding it with Christian prayers and symbols, they were attempting to control and limit what could come through that portal. They were building spiritual guardrails. When those guardrails were removed, when governments banned the traditions and scattered the knowledge of how to perform them correctly, they didn't eliminate Krampus. They just eliminated the controls. Now the doorway could open randomly, without the proper ritual framework, and what came through couldn't be directed or appeased. This may explain the increase in strange encounters in the late 20th century. Not because Krampus was getting stronger, but because the traditional channels for his manifestation had been disrupted. He was appearing in uncontrolled ways, in places and times where he wasn't expected, because the ritual calendar that had regulated his appearances for centuries was no longer being observed. But there's another possibility, one that's even more disturbing. What if the bans and suppression weren't mistakes? What if they were deliberate, designed not to eliminate Krampus but to destabilize him, to break the old bargains and agreements that had kept him bound to specific times and places? If you wanted to study something, to capture it or control it, the worst approach would be to confront it directly within its own ritual framework, where it's most powerful and most protected. But if you could disrupt that framework, scatter the knowledge, create chaos around the traditions, then you might catch it off guard. Might bring it into environments where you had more control, more ability to observe and interact. There's evidence that certain government agencies, particularly in Nazi Germany and Soviet Russia, had deep interests in the occult and in harnessing supernatural forces for political and military purposes. Both regimes conducted extensive research into areas that modern science dismisses. They took seriously the possibility that there were forces and entities that could be contacted and potentially controlled. What if the Krampus bans were cover for exactly this kind of operation? Publicly forbid the traditions but secretly study them. Deliberately create conditions where manifestations would happen in uncontrolled settings where researchers could observe without the interference of traditional practitioners who knew how to manage the encounters. This would explain the pattern of suppression followed by continued government interest. It would explain why, even today, there are restricted archives related to folklore research from the mid-20th century, files that remain classified for no obvious reason. What are they hiding? What did they find? The answer may lie in understanding what Krampus represents at a deeper level. He's not random chaos or mere malevolence. He's judgment. He operates according to rules, old rules that predate human law. In the traditional stories, he doesn't punish arbitrarily. He punishes those who have violated something fundamental, not just naughty children, but those who have broken faith with the natural order. This is why totalitarian regimes feared him, not because he was powerful in a military sense, but because he represented a form of judgment that couldn't be appealed to or controlled by human authority. If people believed in Krampus, truly believed that there was a force that would judge their actions independent of state law, then the state's monopoly on punishment was broken. There was a higher court, an older law. And in a society that's increasingly disconnected from nature, from traditional wisdom, from any sense of sacred order, what would Krampus judge? What would he punish? Perhaps that's why the encounters have been increasing. Not because belief has grown, but because violations have grown. We've broken so many natural laws, ignored so many warnings, that we've accumulated a debt. And Krampus is the collector. He's always been the collector. That's his function, his purpose. Not evil, but necessary. As necessary as death, as winter, as the culling of the herd that ensures the survival of the species. We've spent this investigation pulling at threads, examining evidence, questioning the official narrative. Now we need to step back and look at the complete tapestry those threads create. What is the real history of Krampus, and what does it reveal about our world? Krampus is not a folk character created by medieval peasants to scare children into obedience. He is a survival, a remnant of humanity's oldest spiritual understanding. Before organized religion, before civilization itself, our ancestors recognized that reality contained forces that were neither human nor divine in the way we understand divinity. These forces were part of nature itself, expressions of fundamental laws. Krampus represents the law of balance. For every life preserved, another must be given. For every summer of plenty, a winter of scarcity. For every child that thrives, another that doesn't. This is not cruelty. It's ecology. It's the mathematics of survival in a world that cannot support infinite growth. Our ancestors knew this and created rituals to acknowledge it, to negotiate with it. The Krampus tradition was one such ritual. By giving form to the force of winter death, by naming it and facing it, communities created a framework for understanding and accepting the losses that would inevitably come. The ritual didn't prevent children from dying. It helped communities process those deaths, to see them not as random tragedy, but as part of a larger pattern. When Christianity arrived, it brought a different cosmology, one where death was evil, a punishment for sin or a test of faith, one where nature itself was fallen and corrupt. This worldview couldn't accommodate something like Krampus, a force that was neither good nor evil, but simply necessary. So the church did what it had to do. It tried to absorb him, to make him part of Christian mythology as a demon servant to a saint. But the mask didn't fit perfectly. The old knowledge persisted in the villages, in the families who maintained the traditions. They knew Krampus wasn't a demon. They knew he was older, deeper, outside the Christian framework entirely. And they kept that knowledge alive even as official culture tried to forget it. Then came the modern age, with its totalitarian certainty that reality could be completely controlled, completely understood through ideology and science. Fascists, Nazis, and communists all shared this arrogant belief that human will could reshape reality itself. And all three encountered the same problem with Krampus. He didn't fit. He couldn't be controlled or explained away. He represented something outside their systems, something that operated by rules they didn't make and couldn't break. So they tried to eliminate him, and they almost succeeded. Almost. But they made a crucial mistake. They thought Krampus was a tradition, a practice that could be stopped by arresting people and burning costumes. They didn't understand that he was never dependent on human belief or practice. The traditions weren't creating him. They were managing him, channeling him, providing a safe outlet for something that existed regardless. When the traditions were suppressed, when the knowledge was scattered and lost, Krampus didn't disappear. He became unmoored, appearing in unexpected ways, in places where there was no ritual framework to contain him. The increase in strange encounters, in unexplainable events during the winter months, isn't because belief has increased. It's because the controls have been removed. We live now in a world that has forgotten how to deal with the forces our ancestors understood. We've paved over the sacred groves, dammed the holy rivers, built cities on ground that was marked as forbidden. And we think we're safe because we don't believe anymore, because we've declared these things to be folklore. But belief is irrelevant. You don't have to believe in gravity for it to work. You don't have to believe in Krampus for him to function. He's not a thought form sustained by faith. He's an expression of natural law, as real as decay and winter and death itself. The question facing us now is not whether Krampus is real. The evidence overwhelmingly suggests that something real lies behind the legends, something that manifests when conditions are right and that operates according to consistent rules. The question is what we do with this knowledge. The path our civilization has chosen is to deny, to suppress, to pretend these older realities don't exist. But denial doesn't protect us. It just leaves us unprepared when the veil thins and we encounter what we've been pretending isn't there.